joining us today in our studio, we have a very special guest, Mr. Peter Hitchens. Peter Hitchens is an English journalist, broadcaster, columnist, and as he describes himself in his book, jobbling scribbler for many years. He's here to talk about his book, The Rage Against God, or Opstand tegen God, which appears this month at uitgeverij De Blauwe Tijger. Well, it's not a new book by any means. It's
no, not at all.
Written
it's getting quite middle-aged now.
Written in 2010 as a request of your American publisher in, I thought it was, as a sort of direct conversation or rebuttal of your late brother's.
That's right, yeah.
Books,
they
yes.
approached me and said, would I write a retort to my brother's book, God is Not Great?
So it's not
Which
only...
it completely and directly is.
Yes.
There's no pretense about it. That's what it is.
Yes, it's also a very personal account of your return to the pews of the Anglican Church, and it's also a very spirited rebuttal of the three main arguments of atheists.
I think so.
And it's a very, bleak vision of the future of Great Britain as a nation, which you claim is doomed.
Completely finished, yeah.
Yes, because as you state, the only thing that stands between utter barbarism and a civil society is the Christian or Protestant values, as these are slowly eroded.
Not values, virtues.
Virtues,
yeah,
of course, yes.
Values.
Yes.
Values is an advertising man. Let's have something solid.
Right.
Virtues, a thing which, again, it's difficult to pronounce now.
Yes.
The word virtue itself is very much out of fashion.
Yes, yeah.
Always a good thing to be out of fashion.
Well, obviously, it's been almost 10 years since you wrote the book. We've seen tremendous changes, not only in the Church of England, but also in the English government, religion in general. We've seen the rise of a theocratic state in the Middle East. We've seen the election of a radical pope. How much worse have things become since?
Well, a bit worse, but I can't claim to have been surprised. One of the many enjoyable things about being a pessimist, an attitude to life I recommend to everybody, is that you don't get unpleasant surprises.
No, only the reward of being right.
I simply haven't found anything in recent years which has particularly shocked me, these developments, which broadly anyone could have seen coming.
Yes.
If they'd looked.
If they'd looked, but I don't, you know. Obviously. So, as a good Anglican, you must have some vision of heaven and hell. And coming here to this country, which is known for its liberal drug use, liberal drug laws, abortion, promotion of LGBT values worldwide, and all these very progressive values. Why would you publish this book in the Netherlands? And this hell for your...
This is not my decision. In any case, all the things that you describe are very much present in Britain as well. There's no substantial difference. Perhaps we are maybe less elegant and humorous about it, but we do the same thing. And it wasn't me. I didn't come to the Netherlands and say, please publish my book. I received an email saying, we would very much like to publish your book in Dutch. And I said, well, that would be very good news. I'm always delighted the more people who read it and compliment it. But I also know a bit more about the Netherlands than perhaps quite a lot of people do. I know that in many places it's still a very conservative country where Christianity is taken seriously. Amsterdam and the Netherlands are not the same thing.
No, but many English people
I wasn't
seem to think
completely
so.
surprised at this. The book has a sort of Dutch origin. The publishers in America who originally commissioned it, Zondervan, are ultimately a Dutch company in a very Dutch part of the United States.
They if I'm correct, they come from the Calvinists that emigrated from the Netherlands.
Yeah.
The very strict Calvinists.
Yeah. What other kind of Calvinist is there?
Well, obviously your family history has also been influenced by Calvinism, as you...
Technically, the Church of England is Calvinist. The 39 articles contain Calvinist statements, but there's a big difference, particularly in Britain, between technically and actually.
Yes, of course. So, I think, well, for the Dutch situation, I think many of our readers and our viewers are in total agreement with you that, well, just the same as Britain, our respective nations are going to the dogs, are finished because of the forces of the time and the loss of the civil virtues that held us together. But I also think that, and the loss of institutions that go with it. I mean, the same crisis that strikes the NHS strikes the Dutch healthcare system. The same problems with infrastructure. We also have a very, very bad decline in the state of our railway services and all that. But I also think that many of my readers are very much on the other side, siding more of your brother Christopher, who's somewhat of a saint in our circles, on the God argument. I think mainly because they see religious faith in the form of Islam as the main threat to our nations. So what would you say to these people that want to reclaim the old nation without the Christianity?
My late brother formed a very peculiar alliance with some American conservatives over his opposition to and strong dislike of Islam.
Yes.
But this was it seemed to me always a bit of a feint. He opposed Islam, but fundamentally his target was Christianity. And the American conservatives who welcomed him in as an ally just chose to forget or ignore just how hostile he was to Christianity. Yes. And it seems to me to be perfectly evident that the two things are quite different. Islam and Christianity are not the same religion. They don't have the same consequences. They don't have the same precepts. And it's a different argument. And you can be... You could be unwilling to have the precepts of Islam introduced into your society, but at the same time, you can be Christian. In fact, it seems to me that it's very hard to object to the introduction of Islam into a modern Western society without considering the Christian roots of modern Western society and actually giving the Christian answer to Islam. After all, what else is endless material wealth, is complete self-indulgence, is that an answer to Islam? I don't think it is. The things that are admirable about Islam, whether it's tenacious, clinging to its own principles, its refusal to compromise, and its very, very strong moral sense, and the way in which it requires and generally succeeds in getting its followers to take part in a cultural community which brings them very much together as a strong faith. Yes, these are enviable things, it seems to me, and many of them actually, as far as I can see, are taken from Christianity in its original form. Yes. I always used to have this this moment of satirical humor whenever George W. Bush, when he was president, would go on the television and start describing the Islamist threat to the West, and he would say, "They hate our way of life." And I would be sitting on the sofa in front of my television set shouting, "I hate our way of life too."
Yes. Well, you hate things like television.
That does not make me the enemy of civilization.
No. Rather the opposite,
but what is your answer? What is your answer to Islam? Is it guided missiles and tanks and bombs? Is it the consumer society, or is it an alternative conception of what the moral law should be? Yes. It seems to me if you really object to the spread of Islam, then you must offer an intellectual challenge to it, not a military challenge to it, or a challenge to it based only upon we have more fun. No. And we may not have more fun if our economies continue to go the way they're going, floating on a huge bubble of unrepayable debt. In the case of my country,
yes.
When that comes to an end, you've possibly come across a very interesting book on the great hyperinflation in Germany in the 1920s. The title of the book is haunting. The title of the book is "When Money Dies."
Yes.
And if that happened again in Western society, where would our vaunted superiority over the world of Islam be? What would it be if it's only based on material prosperity and on military strength? Then we wouldn't have that anymore.
So in your book, you talk about religion and the way you experienced Anglican religion as a sort of fake version of the real thing. Do you think that Islam, as it is present now, presents the real thing rather than a sort of...
I don't think I call Anglicanism fake at all. I think that the fake religion in Britain is the sort of Churchill worship, which has taken over our country since the Second World War. It's a very complicated thing about which I've recently completed another book. The idea of the Second World War as being a huge moral event and a kind of parable of goodness and evil,
Yes.
which it isn't really, and it's nothing like that simple. In many ways, that is the English substitute for religion now. The two things we worship are the finest hour and the National Health Service. Those are the British religions.
Yes.
I don't think Anglicanism is fake at all. I think it's actually much derided as a strand in Christianity. It's a very clever synthesis of Catholic and Protestant, which has been very successful in avoiding some of the more stupid sectarian conflicts that other countries have undergone, and saving some of the better things from Roman Catholicism, which the Reformation in some countries swept away totally.
Yes,
I think I'm a great defender of Anglicanism as set out in the 1662 Book of Common Prayer. Yeah. So no, that I wouldn't say that.
Yes.
But on the other, if you want, what I do say is this: that it's that form of Anglicanism, the traditional one, rather than the modernized, eviscerated, saccharine, sweetened version of religion, which is peddled now.
The thing with the guitars and the human rights.
The guitars and the drum kits and the political sermons and the almost total abolition of any idea of penitence.
Right. Yes. And should all be fun.
There isn't. Yeah. We haven't really done anything wrong. We haven't committed any sins. We're not miserable sinners. There is health in us. This is the opposite of what Anglicanism actually stands for.
Yes.
It's too soppy, if that word makes sense.
Well, it does. Yes. Right. I know you loathe a certain 6-letter word, so I won't utter it in your presence.
To work out which 6-letter word that is, actually.
For the unfortunate egress of the United Kingdom from the European Union. But I'm afraid I can't keep it out of the conversation.
No, so the word is...
The events of the week.
The word just makes me think of an unpleasant breakfast cereal of the kind which...
the Weetabix of politics.
A laxative kind.
Yes, very much understandable, yeah. So we haven't really the time to review all your rebuttals of atheism, of course, but there's one that's very important to the Brexit thing, I think. It's that many modern states which claim to be atheist or humanist are in fact not atheist at all, but just replace religion with forms of state worship as a sort of ersatz for religion. Do you think the EU is also engaging in that sort of program?
I think the European Union's original founders generally tended to be old-fashioned Roman Catholic Christian Democrats, though you do have, very interestingly, among the founding fathers and spirits of the European Union, Altiero Spinelli, who was an Italian communist. Yes. I think, though, at some point in the development of the European Union, it embraced a secularism and a rejection of religion. Remember the problems over the appointment of Signor Buttiglione some years ago, and the late Pope John Paul II's attempts to get some sort of reference to Christianity included in what was originally the Constitution and became the Lisbon Treaty, which failed. Yes. I think the European Union is ultimately a secularist and probably a Eurocommunist project now. I think its current state is probably the result of the long march through the institutions of the 1968 generation, who were, in my view, Marxist in inclination, though not in the traditional Soviet communist way, but as cultural revolutionaries particularly, and as people seeking a cultural hegemony for a new and different world, which they've largely achieved. I think it is an organization fundamentally hostile to and incompatible with a Christian Europe.
Yes. So
that if once you've dispensed with Christianity, in the end, I think you do tend towards power worship. Yes.
So, which is of course the main argument you make in your book, that once you dispense with Christianity, all hell breaks loose, literally.
Well, it's not that quick. I have a metaphor here. When I was a small child, I lived on the coast of England, near where the great ocean liners used to set out from Southampton to New York, and you watched them go by. You had to be very careful not to turn your back, because perhaps 5 or 10 minutes after one of these great liners had gone by, 3 kilometers out at sea, a large 2-meter-high wave would come and smack you in the back if you had to turn. But the thing was that the time lap between the passage of the great ship and the arrival of the wave was considerable. And this taught me one thing: things don't always have immediate effects, but they often have effects anyway that you might not be expecting.
Yes.
I think there is a time lag between the collapse of Christianity and the collapse of Christian societies in which we now live.
So what's the connection between the collapse of Christianity and the majority of certainly people of your generation and above, who somewhat grew up more in the Anglican Church than younger generations, in the effect on Brexit vote?
I don't think it has very much to do with it, actually. I don't think there was any really religious element in the vote to leave the European Union. What the vote was there were several elements in the campaigns to leave the European Union, sometimes very nearly contradictory. There are modern globalists, ultra-liberals who want to open Britain to free trade from all around the world. There were people such as me who want to preserve as much as possible of the English 1,000-year-old tradition of particularly of common law and presumption of innocence, and generally a legal and parliamentary system which is separate from and different from the continental one. Yes. And there was also a huge explosion of discontent, particularly among the working class voters, against mass immigration. Yeah. And these three things all coincided in one vote, which was wholly unexpected by the country's national leadership, and which they don't know how to cope with.
Yes. Well, returning to
Nor do I, by the way. It's not an easy thing to do. I would never have held a referendum, and I'm against them. I would have wanted to come out of the European Union through a general election, which is the proper constitutional way.
Yes. So even your pessimism hadn't prepared you for the chaos that followed the referendum.
I saw it coming sooner than most people. I predicted an awful lot of what was going to happen in terms of the obstruction which the British establishment would put in the way of the implementation of the vote, which I think I was completely accurate in. And towards the end of the campaign, I did become aware of how big the surge of anger against immigration was, and therefore there was going to be the vote to leave, which I hadn't expected, but which I was among the first to predict.
Yes. So this wave of mass immigration, is that connected in a sense to this march of institution of Marxist you?
Actually, it is connected to what I believe to be the Eurocommunism of the Blair government. Yes. People always, in Britain, many people believe that the Blair government was in some way conservative, which I've always disputed. I think that the Blair government was a particular British version of Eurocommunism, that it was extremely radical both domestically and internationally. It was in favour of supranational institutions, of the absorption of Britain into the European Union at a faster rate. It was in favour of cultural and moral revolution on a large scale, which it implemented, and also in favour of a much greater role for the state in the lives of the people, which it succeeded in doing. What's interesting about it is how many senior figures in New Labour turn out to have been, roughly at the time that I myself was a Marxist-Leninist in the late 1960s and early 1970s, they turn out to have been too. I think I can identify 6 members of Blair's cabinet who were former Marxist-Leninists, including Blair himself, which is a fact not widely known. That Blair has recently openly revealed that he was a Trotskyist.
Yes, so you felt this yourself.
This is something I definitely. But the difference between me and them, there are many differences between me and them, but on this is that I've always been open about it, that I discuss it, that I'm quite clear that I have rejected it, and I explain why I rejected it. Whereas if you find British left-wing politicians, particularly at senior levels, and you ask them about if you can even get close enough to ask them about their Marxist-Leninist past, they get very, very shy about it, and they don't want to talk about it. And this, in my view, is because it still has an influence on their thinking. So you had a government in which you have 6 former Marxist-Leninists, and in one of the advisors to this government, a man called Andrew Neither, wrote an extraordinary article a few years ago in which he revealed that the discussions that the New Labour had about their immigration policy had included the use of immigration as a deliberate policy, as he put it, to rub the right's noses in diversity, and fundamentally to make it impossible afterwards ever to re-establish a more conservative country. That immigration was indeed a weapon in their armory. And
it backfired,
well, it didn't backfire. It happened. They succeeded in it, and Britain is irreversibly altered. It is not
Yeah.
the same country that it was in 1997. It's hugely different, and the change is not going to be reversed, and nobody could reverse it by any conceivable civilized means.
No, of course not. So, as a repentant Trotskyite, what is this pool of Marxism that still hangs over the left? I mean, there was this Dutch magazine last week that came out with a Marx special, where they, the Groene Amsterdammer, where one of the things they tried to cast him as the first eco-warrior. What's this?
Well, good luck with that. The fascinating thing about Marx is that really, to me, it seems that people have been obsessed with his economic legacy, with particularly with the Soviet interpretation,
Yes.
or to some extent, I suppose, of the old German social democratic interpretation,
Yes.
Which was based on trade unions and their interests, which was all about nationalization of industry and state control of the economy and all that sort of thing. These seem to me never to have been central to Marx's ideas. Marx was really a Jacobin. He was a French revolutionary reborn. Yes. He was radical about the idea of beginning the world over again, creating a new type of human being and a new sort of world. The state withers away, and the kingdom of reason reigns, and all the old superstitions and follies of the past are pushed to one side by a relentless progress under the smiling gaze of a benevolent history. History is the god of Marxism.
Yes, yeah.
History is always referred to when Marxists are asked for any authority as to why what they're doing is better than the alternative. They say, well, history will validate us. History is history. So that is fundamentally what it was about. And you read the original 1848 manifesto. It's extremely radical. It's also remarkably pro-capitalist document, much more than most people who don't know about it would suspect. And I think that element of Marxism has finally re-emerged from under the huge rock of Soviet communism, which fell on top of it, and it's crawled out from under that, and it's now much more engaged in open borders internationalism, in multiculturalism, in what is loosely termed political correctness, in the reordering of the sexual relations between men and women, parents and children, and also in ultimately, because once you destroy private life, which in my view destroying the married family will do, you create a much more direct relationship between the individual and the state, in which the state is much more powerful. Yes. And so forget about nationalizing the railways or the steel industry, if you still have a steel industry. What the new Marxists do is they nationalize childhood.
Yes, that's one of the more haunting passages in your book, when you describe your time as a foreign correspondent in Moscow, and you visit or drive past one of the state nurseries where fathers weren't allowed and desperate mothers threw
and that was maternity hospital.
Maternity hospital.
But the nurseries were horrible, and it was so arranged in Soviet society that if two parents combined their incomes, they could afford to live, but no couple could afford to live or raise children on one income. So you were compelled to have both parents out working for wages. So you were compelled to put your children in some sort of state care, unless you had a handy grandmother who could take over the job, which some people did. But otherwise, the state took over childhood from a very, very early stage. Yes. And also, the marriage bond was extremely weak. Almost all the couples that we knew in Moscow, Russian couples we knew in Moscow who had two children, the children were half brothers or half sisters. Very, very seldom were they actually brothers and sisters, because almost invariably the couple were on at least their second marriages because of the weakness of marriage and the ease of divorce, which the Soviet state promoted. Yes. And then there's the awful, haunting figure of Pavlik Morozov, the young pioneer's hero, to whose statue they used to be conducted to pay obeisance. And Morozov's great deed, as far as the Soviet system was concerned, was to have betrayed his parents to the secret police. And children were taught to worship this individual. Yeah. That seems to me to symbolize the real fundamental diabolical difference between Soviet society. You could take the stupid economy and to some extent even the single party system and all the rest of it. These were things which might have existed elsewhere. But the uniquely Marxist thing about the Soviet Union was the worship of Pavlik Morozov.
Yes, and of course the destruction of the traditional family bonds, which is something the EU is very keen on. Promoting in your view with all the LGBT focus.
In modern Western societies, the subtlety of the left, who never give up and who learn from their defeats, is they don't present the destruction of Christian marriage as that. They present it as the promotion of all kinds of relationships on an equal basis. And this is how it's done. This is how Christianity has been dethroned from its prime place in the British legal and cultural system. The Equalities Act of 2010 made all religions equal. Well, it sounds very nice, doesn't it? But what it means is that Christianity is now legally equal to Jainism, Buddhism, Islam, Hinduism, Baha'i, or anybody else who happens to be passing by. Now, if it is the established religion in society and everything, all law, culture and practice has been based upon it hitherto, then to be made equal with all these other religions is to be deposed, and it has been deposed. But it's not put like that.
No.
It's presented as an act of generous equality.
Yeah,
and they're brilliant at that sort of thing.
Yes.
And I think I admire the left both for their endless, relentless persistence, and for their extreme cleverness in reforming their battalions when defeated and coming back and attacking again. They keep on coming.
So what is the failing of the true blue conservatives?
There aren't any. There is no.
You're a one-man army.
There is no coherent. There is no coherent politically and socially conservative force that I can identify in any major Western, formerly Christian country. The supposedly conservative parties, such as the Conservative Party in Britain and the Republican Party in the United States, are really, in economic terms, they're ultra-liberal parties.
Yes.
And in social and cultural terms, they are clueless. They don't understand, lacking my huge advantage in being an ex-Marxist. They don't understand the enemy. And because they don't understand him, they very often end up adopting his policies. Yes.
So what about, because when I speak to conservatives here in the Netherlands or very orthodox religious persons, they always speak in hushed tones of reverence about Russia, sort of a state that has turned back and bounced back from this Marxist hell. And
well, I wouldn't go that far. Russia may take, if it ever recovers from 74 years of Bolshevism, if it ever recovers from that awful experience, then it will probably take 2 centuries to do so. It's far from recovering. It is at the moment a sinister despotism. I don't think anybody should be in any doubt about the fact that Vladimir Putin is a sinister tyrant and that he runs a government which is both brutal, lawless and corrupt, and it's very unwise to get involved in defending the indefensible in countries such as that. There are aspects, particularly of Russian foreign policy, which I will defend because they seem to me to be reasonable in their own terms and in our terms too. But that doesn't make me an apologist for the Putin regime.
So the cozying up of Putin to the Orthodox Church is something you ignore?
The Orthodox Church has always tried to have good relations with whatever state is in power. It's in its nature to do so, and in this case it's doing the same thing, and that is obviously complicated from the Christian point of view. There are injunctions in Scripture that ultimately the Christian should obey authority, and there is the distinction between those matters which are Caesar's and those which are God's, which have always been made. But of course there are points at which this breaks down, at which the Christian looks, which of course many Christians in Germany experienced in the 1930s, where the readiness of Christians to support governments simply cannot survive the abuse of power by those governments. And it's something which I almost can't be envisaged and isn't envisaged in the Gospels in any clear way, it seems to me, unless you just look directly at the key sections of the Sermon on the Mount and you think, how can this possibly be compatible with the injunction to leave power alone? It isn't. Ultimately, the central passages of the Sermon on the Mount seem to me to be the test against which every part of the Christian religion, every part of Scripture has to be measured. And if it fails against that measure, then it has to be rethought.
Right. So one thing I've noticed about your writings and your columns and your book is that you never really talk down to the common people that ought to be filling the pews, but in return to the church, but always focus on sort of the intellectual classes of the writers, the journalists, the academics,
I'm honestly not sure what you mean by that.
Well, when I read your book, you talk a lot about how in polite middle class circles in academia or politics or journalism, it's almost to have a rare and very transmittable disease if you're religious or espouse conservative views.
I write about what I know. I am a middle class person. This is the world in which I live.
Yes,
I can only really describe it. I believe I do describe it truthfully and reliably, but I wouldn't try to pretend to describe parts of our very class-divided society in which I do not live.
No, okay, yes. So.
It would be like writing an essay on Rwanda, never having been there. And we are a terribly class-ridden country, and we do live separate lives. And obviously, it doesn't mean there's no contact between us. But the fact is, I couldn't really honestly or truthfully describe the lives of people in other classes than my own.
So you never had the temptation to do, as many British journalists do, to go on a class safari and go either up or down?
I've been on a class safari, and one of the things that it taught me was how little I knew about other people, and that to know properly whole parts of my country would involve a great deal more experience than I was ever likely to get. These people have been, the same was true when I began to get to know Russians. These people have been brought up in a world completely different from mine.
Yes. And
I can get flashes of mutual understanding, but in the end that difference is very profound.
Yes. So
and I certainly don't possess the sort of the imaginative powers to cross them.
That's interesting. Very, very humble as well.
No, it's just true. I think
many journalists.
It's regressible. I think the English class system is a tragedy. Yeah. I think it results in a huge amount of waste of talent, apart from anything else, and an awful lot of stupid, unforgivable snobbery, which I try very, very hard to have nothing to do with. Yes. But it is absolutely stupid to pretend that we don't have this problem, and very, very deeply.
Yes, but among our fellow journalists, there seems to be very little inhibition to just take the elevator in the class system and go down and describe it.
Let them. Maybe they're better at it than I am. I don't know. I just can't do it.
All right. So returning to the middle class, which is of course where we're both most comfortable. One of the interesting columns I've read of you lately described the sort of shibboleths to be accepted into middle class polite society is the exception of certain policies in regard to drugs and abortion.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate for our readers?
Well, yes. It is generally. When I was at university between 1970 and 1973, at what was then a new university, the University of York, it was said that I and a future Labour politician, Harriet Harman, who eventually became Deputy Prime Minister, were the only two students at York who did not smoke marijuana. And that may well be true. There was a huge invasion of drug culture into the English-educated middle classes in the 60s and 70s. And to some extent, it was the shared joint was a sort of Holy Communion rite. It goes together with rock music. The Holy Trinity of the New World is sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Yeah.
And in that era, self-indulgence became not despicable but admirable and normal. And all these things were considered to be so. And I had rows when I broke with the left. I had rows with former friends of mine over politics. I had rows with former friends of mine also over drugs. I actually on one occasion I threw an old friend out of my flat because he insisted on smoking dope, and I said, "You can't do that here. I'm not having it." And it was an end of a friendship, because I had my particular type of Marxism was a fairly Puritan type of Marxism, and I sustained some of my more Puritan aspects, which would normally have been associated with Christianity. I sustained them through a different moral basis, but I carried on sustaining them, so I'm different from them. And the question of abortion, I think the there certainly was a great fear in our generation that we would become like our parents. And I quote from an Antonio Byatt book, The Virgin in the Garden, a small passage about the terror of ending up living in the suburbs, going to work every day, little garden gate, and becoming your mother and father. And of course the step which begins the process of turning into your parents is having children, and the fear of having children is very strong, and was particularly strong. I think this is another important thing. It's not quite as strong now, particularly strong 30 years ago, before mass immigration came, because people couldn't afford servants.
Yes.
And once the English middle class were able to afford foreign servants, they were more willing to have children.
Yes. Yeah.
And that became, but even so, anybody who was against abortion was basically saying, well, if you get pregnant, then you've got to have the baby, and you've got to follow the course of life which has come to you. And this really, really strong desire to defy your natural station in life and your fate by dispensing with the children you otherwise have is a very powerful evocation of what I call selfism.
Yes.
The worship of the self above all things, and the putting of the self first to such an extent that you are prepared to kill another human being.
Yes.
Though you will always lie about what the action is, to continue in the life that you've become accustomed to.
Yeah, that's also
important. And the same people, by the way, are passionately furious at any suggestion by me that it might sometimes be advisable to execute convicted murderers.
Yes, you are in favour of that.
This is not. You can't do that. You can kill an innocent baby in the womb, but you cannot kill a man who has killed other people and has been convicted of this crime in a fair court.
So are you in favour of the death penalty out of biblical reasons or traditional English reasons?
I have several reasons. I can give you, if you are of a religious disposition, I can tell you there are religious reasons why it is actually superior. I hate, by the way, I absolutely hate prisons. I think long prison terms are tremendously cruel. I myself, having seen inside some prisons, would much rather be executed than spend long periods of time in them. I have no doubt about that. Long prison terms are barbaric. And there are also straightforward utilitarian reasons if you maintain a serious deterrent, and but quite honestly, it does seem to me to be strange that in our current society we don't value life any more highly than property.
Yes.
That there's no distinction made. If you steal a large enough sum, you'll get as long a prison term as you would for stealing somebody's life. I think that's a complete failure of proportion myself.
Yes.
But these are outrageous statements in modern Britain,
Yes.
and it's why I simply do not get invited to dinner in several London postal districts.
Yes.
They wouldn't have me there because I am a sort of, if I believe that, then I'm obviously a Nazi.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Right. So last two questions. Well, in your book, you obviously tackle many of the founding myths of contemporary Britain. You tackle the idea that Britain won the Second World War instead of lost the empire. The idea that Churchill is a sort of demigod who single-handedly pulled England through the Second World War.
Some of that is true,
yes,
but just not all of it.
Yes, but you also look at the other side of his personality as a belligerent drunk who was in it for.
No, I don't criticize his drinking. I think that this is the personal attack. He seemed to cope with the drink. No, he wasn't infallible. No. He wasn't a demigod, and he did one profoundly great thing, which probably nobody else could have done, which is to have refused to negotiate with Germany in 1940. He made many mistakes, and
especially the First World War,
but Britain was on the winning side of the Second World War, but was not actually a victor. It's once you recognise the difference, it's easy to see how important this is.
Yeah, so you bring all your considerable acuity and wit and maybe cynicism or pessimism to bear on these myths.
Kind of you to say so.
Well, and I was wondering, weren't you ever inclined to put the sort of founding of the Anglican Church through the same paces. After all, it's a church founded on the whims of a devious king who likes women too much and the Pope too little.
It's not true. This is actually a Roman Catholic propaganda myth, the founding of the Anglican Church.
Well, I'm Roman Catholic.
Much more complicated. Well, it's what here. I mean, then you should read a recent essay that I've written in First Things magazine on the whole subject.
Yes.
Henry VIII, who is hugely demonized by Roman Catholics as the man who destroyed Roman Catholicism, was to his dying day a devout Roman Catholic. He was never a Protestant. He didn't want England to become Protestant, and was furiously hostile to Martin Luther. So that can't be true. The Roman Catholic version of it doesn't quite work. Also, the other fact I must supply you with is that King Henry VIII was never once divorced.
Right,
his marriages were annulled.
Yes, yeah, of course.
And I have to say that his annulments were no more out of order or unjust than those granted to Senator Edward Kennedy in more recent times by the Roman Catholic Church. This is not a. If we were to discuss it at length, then we could have a separate interview on it. But it's just a matter of looking into it. It's not that simple.
Yes.
And if you look at the Reformation in the British Isles, at the difference between the Reformation in England and the Reformation in Scotland. Yeah. Reformation in Scotland, in which they actually tore down the great cathedral of St Andrews, and you look at how much of Catholic tradition, beauty, music, and ritual survived in the Anglican settlement. Well, I think it's
except the monastic life, of course.
Wise to be grateful.
The great abbeys of England were all.
The abbeys, yes, but the great cathedrals survived, and an awful lot besides was preserved, and in most countries which underwent the Reformation, and of course, when anti-Catholicism finally came to France, when that happened there, they lost much more. Much more survives in England of pre-16th century Catholicism than in any other Protestant country.
Yes. Right. So tonight, football is apparently coming home. I know you won't be watching because
you can be sure of that. Yeah.
Is this a sort of ray of hope for England?
Why would it matter if a country's national football team, which has no organic relation with the country, who chooses these people? Not me. If 11 rich professional sportsmen kicking a bladder around a field score more goals than 11 rich professional sportsmen from another country.
Well,
what difference does it make?
The most lasting thing the British Empire brought to the world.
At the end of that evening, is Britain richer? Is Britain stronger? Is Britain safer? Is Britain more independent? Is Britain more free? Has anything substantial happened? No. It's, as far as I'm concerned, it's a sort of pagan ceremony. It has no relevance to me at all. And what's more, there's something more than faintly ugly to me about football. There's a lot of it. The playing of the game, when I have watched it, has seemed to me to be full of open and actually almost boastful cheating, stupid, petty violence and spite. And an awful lot of the chants that you get from football grounds are fairly unpleasant. And my general rule, if I'm in a big city and I see a football crowd coming towards me, is to go in the opposite direction. What about you?
Well, very wise.
You're not. No, it's not. It's not. Certainly in Britain, it's not a guarantee of a peaceful or polite or civil evening if the area that you're in is full of football fans. No. So I'd see no reason to be enthusiastic about this game.
So for the Dutch Anglophiles, you advise to read an excellent book on Britain instead of cheer for the.
All I say about this is, if you don't like my opinion, that's fine, but don't expect me. Don't assume that there's something wrong with me, that I'm abnormal or in some way to be condemned because I don't share your enthusiasm. That's all I ask. What I really object to about the cult of football is the way in which it assumes that if you're not part of it, there's something wrong with you.
Yes,
think it possible it might be the other way around, is all that.
Something it shares with Marxism and all the other isms we've spoken about today, of course.
Yeah, of course.
Right, Mr. Hitchens, thank you very much for making time for us to talk about your book. I implore all our viewers to buy it. You can buy it online and in the better bookstores.
I hope. Thank you so much.
you.